a warm welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Over the coming weeks, we will be taking an in-depth look at the challenges and opportunities associated with investing in Africa. We'll be traveling up and down the continent, getting insight into the various economic territories across Africa. This week, we travel to the Horn of Africa for a closer look at the investment opportunities and challenges in the East African nation of Ethiopia.
Officially known as the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, Ethiopia is a landlocked country situated in the Horn of Africa. With close to 82 million inhabitants, this East African nation is regarded as the second most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa and also the most populous landlocked nation in the world. Its capital city of Addis Ababa serves as headquarters for both the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It also recently played host to this 22nd World Economic Forum on Africa. Despite being celebrated as Africa's oldest independent country, Ethiopia has faced a lot of hardships throughout its history. The country has suffered periodic droughts and famines that led to a long civil conflict in the 20th century and a border war with Eritrea. Conflict was rife in late 2009. Ethiopia is one of Africa's poorest states, with almost 2/3 of its people illiterate. However, it is regarded as one of the fastest growing non-oil economies in Africa, with Ethiopia set to be one of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world by 2012.
National ownership and leadership and African leadership of its own development, Ethiopia is unique in terms of never having been colonized, was occupied only for a few years, and therefore in terms of its perspective and views, again, a unique contribution to provide. From an economic point of view, Ethiopia is estimated by the IMF and by the Economist Intelligence Unit to be one of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in the next 5 years. Indeed, according to some estimates, it will be number 3 after only China and India in terms of global growth, with an expected growth of over 8%.
The economy is primarily based on agriculture, which contributes 41% to GDP and more than 75% of exports and employs 80% of the population. The major agricultural export is coffee, providing approximately 30.6% of Ethiopia's foreign exchange earnings in 2010 to 2011. Other traditional major agricultural exports are finished leather goods, pulses, and oilseeds. The current government has embarked on a cautious program of economic reform, including privatization of state enterprises and rationalization of government regulation. The government is implementing its ambitious growth and transformation plan, which aims to achieve an average growth rate of 11.2% and meet all Millennium Development Goals.
The plan is ambitious, but it is feasible. It is possible to achieve it, and therefore the thing now is not to nitpick about this and that particular aspect of the plan. The thing to do now is to build on it and push the issue of the implementation of the plan as far and as fast as we possibly can.
Joining me now in studio to give us their views on Ethiopia as an investment destination, Martin Davis, CEO, Frontier Advisory, and John Kachura, Head of Corporate Banking at Barclays Africa. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, looking at the Ethiopian growth and transformation plan, do you believe that 11% growth target is is achievable? Perhaps that's the terminology.
Well, Bronwyn, we saw the Economist magazine a few weeks ago stating that perhaps growth will be somewhat subdued. But, you know, as mentioned, a few of us, John included, we were up there for World Economic Forum a few weeks ago, and the official figures, word on the street has it, are perhaps understated. So perhaps already Ethiopia is in double-digit growth, and 11% may not be as unrealizable as perhaps many would initially assume.
John, agriculture is obviously a huge part of Ethiopia's story going forward, and perhaps the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange has really transformed that landscape, so farmers can now share in 70% of the final export price when it comes to commodities, rather than the 40% they had prior to the Commodity Exchange being established.
Absolutely. So the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange is a perfect example of what can happen when farmers have full information. What the commodity exchange in Ethiopia has done basically is to transform the old system where farmers would sell produce through local cooperatives. And these cooperatives would aggregate and eventually do the export. And the farmer really only knows what the gate price is. What commodities exchange has done in Ethiopia is to give full transparency to that price chain before the commodity is exported. And a lot of countries are looking to that model. When we visited Ethiopia during the World Economic Forum, quite a few government officials actually went to see what happens in the commodity exchange. I know Kenya has been trying to put something together. I know there is one Africa-wide that is trying to be put together in Botswana. I know that Nigeria is interested in putting something together that's very much akin to the commodity exchange model in Ethiopia.
Were you impressed by the commodity exchange model, Martin?
I think what is wrong, just speaking generally, is that supposedly Africa has 85 million smallholder subsistence farming type farmers, or farming families perhaps. The imperative, if we are, the figure we often hear is between 40 to 60% of the world's arable land remains in Africa. If we are truly to tap into and leverage this potential, we have to marketize our resource sectors around agribusiness. There's no better example than Ethiopia, as mentioned in that introduction, 40% odd contribution to GDP. I think the commodities exchange goes some way, perhaps even learning lessons around India, getting small farmers into a market, access to information, know what the sort of the market value, the sales value, and what the income will be from that trade effectively. The marketization of small agricultural, small holdings on the continent, it's an imperative.
Extensive opportunity, and again, as we heard in the introduction, plus 80 million people, so above that number and growing. But we've got inflation sitting at around 32% in this country.
Yes.
It's a big barrier, basically, to continued growth of this nature.
Absolutely. Look, I think what that tells you is that the real growth is probably, unfortunately, negative. But that said, one has to remember that Ethiopia is coming from a low base, first of all, so 11% is an achievable number. Two is that inflation is a very controllable number. Growth is a lot harder to push. Inflation is a lot easier to control. And I think looking at what the government is doing, if you look at the things that the government did between 2008 and now 2012 in terms of their financial sector, making sure that they come with rules about their monetary policy and changing it to basically control inflation, it is very fathomable that that inflation number will come down very quickly. What's a lot harder to control is the growth number.
Do you believe that inflation is going to come down quickly?
I think it will. I think it won't come down to sort of single digits anytime, very soon, but it'll start to be more subdued, and that's a very positive. I think the main driver we see this. I mean, there's some parallels here. Looking at, I know the Ethiopian government, for example, has been taking a lot of advice from the Chinese government, having similar experiences back in the mid to late 80s. Of very high growth, very high inflation, which ultimately, as John alludes to, hits the poorest the hardest. So from a social stability perspective, from a political stability perspective, it's important that obviously Ethiopian government seeks to contain this sort of this surge of inflation, which unfortunately is hitting the poorest people the hardest.
Martin, looking at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report 2012, Ethiopia was ranked at 111 out of 183 countries. I suppose what's important here, and this is for 2012, is where has Ethiopia come from? Are we moving forward in terms of the ease to do business, or are we going backwards? I
think the challenge is largely twofold. Is when one looks at the recent history, economic history of Ethiopia, it was said to me recently that under the Mengistu sort of regime, the total wiping out almost of private enterprise in Ethiopia, it made almost the Eastern Bloc look pretty capitalist in comparison. So the destruction of private economic activity was the first issue. I think secondly, resulting from that, it's a far deeper sort of psychological issue in the country. How do you rapidly move or try to redirect an economy or society away from a very Marxist sort of closed-mindedness, state-heavy, bureaucratic approach to doing things, to one which is seeking to boost in entrepreneurship, high growth, and as John alluded to, is marketizing the economy. So I think Ethiopia is becoming extremely low base. The most important thing, the most striking thing for me during the World Economic Forum was we had, just a personal anecdote if I may, Bob Geldof was there. And here was Bob Geldof, who back in the 80s exposed the atrocious conditions or impact of conflict in terms of the famine and the starvation, which all of us in our formative years remember Ethiopia for. 20-odd years later, Bob Geldof is in Ethiopia at World Economic Forum talking about his private equity fund wanting to invest in Ethiopia. And I think Ethiopia is perhaps the macro challenge, external challenge at least, to start to really do you have a country of such a very, very bad brand. And I think how does it reposition its brand away from starvation and famine, which many of us remember Ethiopia for, rather towards a high-growth frontier economy in Africa.
But it is changing those perceptions. And ignore Ethiopia at your peril, would you say, John?
Absolutely. Look, with a population of 84 million people, and a country that, you know what was interesting is, building up to the World Economic Forum, everyone was talking about how we're going to be out of BlackBerry, out of phone reach, out of all that good stuff. Yet everything worked when we were there, which tells you the country is changing. The country is not just opening to the international, to China and India. It's actually opening to the rest of Africa. I thought that was phenomenal. It's absolutely opening.
Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. John Kuchura is the head of corporate banking, Barclays Africa. We're going to a quick commercial break now. When we return, we'll be zoning in on the privatization of state-owned enterprises in Ethiopia. Martin Davis stays with us. Privatization of state-owned assets across the African continent is a theme that is unfolding very quickly. At the moment, Ethiopia's railway system is currently being reviewed, and one of the solutions being tabled is privatization of these assets. Let's take a look.
A proposed 6,000 kilometers of railway network that will not only link the major cities and towns of Ethiopia, but will form part of fundamental business links between the country and the global economy.
There's a lot of discussion about why we need infrastructure, because we can't build infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. And what has come out is that Africa needs to industrialize so that we can trade amongst ourselves, we can exchange commodities and trap capital on the African continent.
Like most African nations, the lack of infrastructure poses grave economic challenges. And in a bid to pull the regions towards market integration, the Ethiopian government has invested in projects, including roads, dams and railways to be completed by 2015. The total construction of the railway line is estimated to cost just under $10 billion. And although financing may present a speed bump, economic experts are saying that the government can fund the development. This through the privatization of its 5 biggest enterprises, namely Ethiopian Airlines, Shipping, Telecommunications, Insurance Corporation, and the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. Revenue from the sale of the 5 entities could add up to $7.7 billion, whilst further privatization of the 81 state-owned enterprises could generate a further $9.6 billion. According to the World Bank, the African continent has an annual infrastructure deficit of $90 billion, and aiming to close this gap, Ethiopia has already accepted just over $120 million in bids for the privatization of 7 of its state-owned entities. And the state-dominated country will be selling off approximately 40 state enterprises over the next few years.
We can look for ways of combining private sector financing, public sources, to close this gap of 90 billion. Yeah. It is not so much the lack of capital. Raising 90 billion in today's world is plain vanilla. Sure. But there must be proper structure and frameworks for it.
Studies have shown that the sale of state enterprises can stimulate foreign direct investment, such as in the case of the Chinese state-owned company that will roll out 339 kilometers of railway between Addis Ababa and the Red Sea state of Djibouti. Although the income stream that can be derived from privatization is evident, there are some criticisms to adopting this policy. Some of the main concerns expressed by experts are the transfer of national assets to foreign ownership, increased costs incurred from privatized service providers, for example, fees derived from banking operations, and the discontinuation of unprofitable parts of businesses, which may have provided a much-needed service. While the IMF has projected Ethiopia's growth rate at a conservative 7.5 and 5.5% for 2012 and 2013 respectively, Ethiopia is projecting a more optimistic GDP growth rate of more than 11% by 2014. Based mainly on transformation through its infrastructure projects, it seems that the Horn of Africa could very well be at the helm of an economic takeoff.
Still with me in studio, Martin Davies. He is the CEO of Frontier Advisory, and joining us for the second half of the show, Pete Sabola, Head of Capital Markets at PRASA. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. Well, looking at this theme in terms of the privatization of state-owned assets, and in particular, we talk about the railway line here in Ethiopia is a key focal point for investors at the moment. Perhaps, Pete, we can bring you in terms of whether this is a good idea and the opportunities that it presents for investors.
Thanks for that. Look, I mean, it's always an opportune moment not to ever crowd out private investment where there are obviously opportunities to come in for private participation in the rail sector, any other parts of the market. You can safely have that. But of course, I mean, if you take the rail environment into account in this case, you have to ensure two things. Of course, there are issues around market failures and whatever the case might be. But for a country to consider those, you have to be careful. And in this case, in the Ethiopian space, you have to look into two things. Of course, you have to introduce the efficiencies that will by default come with the private participation in your investment. But most importantly, make sure that whenever you have a rollout of this rail transportation, it ought to be as cheap as possible. And that is why you'll have a fair amount of government participation in making sure that the cost is as effective as it can ever be. Because if the cost push up, then it's going to create some problems over time, over a period ahead.
What are your thoughts, Martin, given that this is a trend that we're seeing unfold furiously across the African continent?
I think, let me just try and link it, the Ethiopian case, to ours now. We call it the developmental state in this country. Perhaps the Ethiopians would call it an assertive state sort of model. Post-2008, post sort of Western financial crisis, questioning of Bretton Woods, market liberalism, if you will. I think I recognize there's an increasing tendency to states to become more assertive, more interventionist, and particularly more seeking more ownership and control of economies in our region. Near the top of the list is Ethiopia, undoubtedly, which is trying to pursue some sort of China model to an extent. Very gradual liberalization, very worried about liberalizing or joining the East African community, fearing Kenyan competition coming in, wiping out nascent Ethiopian enterprise. But Ethiopia is, far way behind South Africa in this sense. In South Africa's case, and you mentioned it, is the notion of crowding out competition. It's not a question of who owns the asset. It's ultimately how one manages the competitive forces.
That asset
efficiency,
can be used.
competitive forces around it. I mean, that's the Singaporean model ultimately, where you can have a state enterprise, but you also at the same time have efficiency and ultimately consumer friendly. I read a recent report, and this is no bad example, from Bloomberg last year, looking at the cost of wharfage of container vessels coming to Durban Harbour. Durban, I think, was ranked in 2010 number 46 in the world in terms of busiest ports. For the top 100 ports, the average wharfage cost per ship was $86,000 US, average across 100 ports. Durban's cost $182,000, more than double the average of a top 100. Now, that's the cost of state ownership. That's the cost of reducing competition in the sector, which is most important: transportation, infrastructure, logistics into our economy. Imagine the knock-on inflationary effect of that.
The risk, though, when it comes to investing in a territory like Ethiopia, as we said, the Ease of Doing Business report from the World Bank 2012, ranking it in 111 out of 183 countries surveyed, which means that the risk is right up there in terms of private sector investment.
No, absolutely. There's always going to be that country risk perspective in any country that you go and invest in. I mean, if you look at the the Ethiopian market and politically has been a very stable country for that matter. That should argue very well. I mean, we have seen in recent time, and especially in the railways since 2010, where we had some aggressive investment with the Chinese coming in and whatever, even India coming in into the to the Ethiopian market, whatever the case might be. So it has been looking more favorably in recent time. But of course, I mean, in whatever it takes, whatever form it takes, whether you come into South Africa or you go to Nigeria, there will always be a risk premium that will be priced out. That shouldn't be the question of whether it's too risky or less risky, whatever the case might be. Any marketers will continuously price that out.
I want to go back to what upgrading the rail system in this territory will do for the country, because I think let's talk about the essence of the transformation that we could see on the ground. Transport, logistics, those are key barriers to growth on the continent. But if we unlock the railways, then we've got a completely different story, haven't we?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Ethiopia as it stands, it's got a very limited rail network as it stands. And like I said, I mean, we've seen in 2010 where they've announced for the first time to extend to about 5,000 kilometer rail network, which is, it goes very well in terms of any economy, because you really need an efficient public transport. And of course, that is competitive at any given time. So that either on the passenger side or whatever on the freight side, that is most important. And I think if this project can be implemented within time, budget, it will certainly argue very well for Ethiopia economy in years ahead.
Martin, what examples are we seeing of successful privatization? I know in 2011 some 20 companies were privatized in Ethiopia. Has that been successful, or is it too early to say?
I think it's early to say. You're seeing it quite a bit in the oil or the energy sector. Southwest Energy, for example, was also mentioned in the Economist magazine recently. I think with a lot of companies waiting to deploy capital, telecommunications, for example. John mentioned earlier about, they literally switched on the BlackBerry data cell phone service for a week whilst the World Economic Forum crowd was in town. The last function at the web finished at 6:30 p.m. 7 p.m. it was switched off once again, and we were back in the dark, so to speak. So I think a lot of it's still early to tell, but a country like Ethiopia certainly has to. It's a question of at what pace. But again, this is a state that does not, seeks to maintain control.
Exactly. I mean, there's a prohibition to investment in banking, foreign investment in banking and insurance and investment, so to say.
Not too dissimilar from China at all. That's what Melis now is doing. He was in China last October. I was in Beijing at the same time, and frequent trips. The two countries that are the largest recipients of capital, infrastructure capital, finance for infrastructure, is Angola and Ethiopia. One is resource poor, one is resource rich. Both the fastest growing economies in Africa. There's got to be something about sort of Chinese financing here. That's important.
Pete, what could be rolled out from our learnings here for the continent, not just Ethiopia, in your opinion, from a transport, from a rail perspective?
Look, I've always been the one who maintain that private participation in the public sector infrastructure rollout is very, very key and is very important. That must always be considered. That shouldn't ever be crowd out. And I think even you have seen in South Africa in recent time where we started looking at some of the PPP models, which I think will work quite fairly well over time ahead. And I think these are some of the things that we should we should be receptive to as we go ahead in our infrastructure rollout investment, especially in the railways, because it's been seen as fairly remote area where we have seen less and less of private participation in some of this infrastructure rollout.
It's going to be a balancing act for the government, isn't it, in terms of meeting its own needs and then allowing the country to embrace private investment. Is it something that is going to take years and years to roll out, or are we now going to see it fast-tracked?
I think in certain sectors, FMCG, for example, recently Heineken, Diageo are making big acquisitions into Ethiopia. I even spent, after the forum, a few days up country, up northern Ethiopia, And every small little poverty-stricken village we went to is Coca-Cola being sold everywhere. I think in 85 million potential consumers, obviously at the base of the pyramid.
So you're seeing FMCG move on the ground?
That's definitely happening. I think in terms of telecoms, the government was liberalising a great deal until Tunisia happened, Arab Spring, and then sort of pulled it back quite a bit. So I think in more strategically sensitive, politically sensitive sectors, telecoms for one, maybe.
What about the energy sector? That's a big theme.
Well, I mentioned oil and gas already, sort of still.
So that obviously
starting to
is
happen. But Ethiopia is a relatively resource-poor country, relatively speaking, compared to its neighbours. And coming back to the infrastructure side, it's geostrategic. I don't think the Ethiopian government wants to be dependent on the East African community, and particularly the Kenyans, in terms of infrastructure. And because of the loss of Eritrea in 1993, is the port access through Djibouti. So I think the rail liberalisation I think that'll happen undoubtedly. There's a strong geopolitical, geostrategic component to this as well.
How long do you think it'll take for that rail liberalisation to roll out? I know I'm asking you gentlemen to look at your crystal balls and say, give me a timeline. I sound as though I'm trying to get market information from you. But it's going to happen. Next 5 years, is that realistic that we'll see the project of rail liberalisation complete?
Look, certainly, I don't see anything. I mean, as long as people are aggressive, are focused, it's certainly achievable within the 5 years. But of course, you will always have some dynamics, especially when you're talking some of these major investment programs. It can take longer. It can be within the time frame that is obviously given. I wouldn't be sitting here and say, well, it's not going to happen, or well, it's certainly going to happen. But I'm optimistic. It can happen.
5 years? Is that unrealistic?
I don't think we can put time periods to this. I think it's rather dependent on the Ethiopian government being able to build capable institutions that can be part of that liberalisation by maintaining strong equity positions in those assets. I don't think that time has come yet. Whether it's, but I think at the same time the pressure is for Ethiopia to continue to maintain, perhaps, as you alluded to earlier, a double-digit growth rate. That force of liberalisation, or at least partial market entry rather, I wouldn't use the word privatization, but partial market entry must continue.
Martin, thanks so much. Peter, appreciate your time. We've come to the end of this week's edition of Invest Africa. We'll be back again at the same time next week. Until then, from me, Bronwyn Nielsen, and my guests, it's goodbye.